Section 3. Well, what shall the poor unlearned Romanist do that finds his great masters at variance in the very foundation of his faith? Here are very two contradictory assertions. One of them must unavoidably be false. A man may with probability at least assert the falsehood of either of them, having the suffrage of diverse of their own most learned Catholic authors for him in either opinion, but whether they be true or false, their cause is lost. First, if they be true, and, number 1, if that be true that tradition be the foundation of the Church's infallibility, then, first, whence hath tradition this infallibility? From Scripture? That they utterly disclaim. From tradition? Then why may not Scripture give testimony to itself as well as tradition? And whence hath that tradition, its infallibility? And so in infinitum. Is it from the reason of the thing? So Mr. White implies, who attempts to prove it by a rational and logical discourse, but himself hath prevented that, while he saith, to lean upon logical inferences is to place the foundation of our faith and the Church in the sand. And as Clarea gives a check to this, it is more reasonable and wise, even for the most learned and acute persons, to rely upon the authority of the Church than to adhere to our own reasonings, how plausible soever. And that is largely disproved in the following discourse. Is it then from the Church's infallibility? This they deny, and allow the Church no infallibility independent upon tradition. Secondly, seeing they grant the Church may err, if she recede from tradition, I can never be sure she doth not err, unless I be sure she keep to tradition. And therefore I must examine that, and judge of it, and so private men are made judges of controversies which they so much dread. Thirdly, hereby the authority of the Pope and general councils of bishops is rendered unnecessary. I prove it thus. If these be necessary only as witnesses to tradition, then their authority is not necessary, for it is not authority, but knowledge and fidelity which renders a witness competent. A lay hearer of St. Paul may be as competent a witness of the doctrine he heard, St. Paul preach, as a bishop, supposing a parity in their knowledge, fidelity, and converse with the apostle. And another bishop may be as competent a witness as the Bishop of Rome, and consequently as infallible. And any congregation of discreet and pious Christians who heard St. Peter preach are as infallible witnesses as the Church of Rome. And if there were a general assembly of laymen of equal knowledge and experience, they are as infallible witnesses what the faith of the next precedent age was, and what the faith of the present Church is as a council of bishops. Nay, to speak truth, they are more credible witnesses, because less biased by interest, affection, or prejudice. These rocks the first branch throws upon them. Number 2, if they fly from this and make the Church's infallibility the foundation of traditions, as the most papists do, then they must demonstrate that infallibility from Scripture, fathers, or councils, which we have seen they cannot do. So that if either of their positions be true, their cause is lost. But secondly, if either of them be false, they are gone too. For if tradition be not infallible in itself without the Church's authority, as the one side saith, then the papists have no certain rule for the Church to steer its course by. For the Scriptures they do not own as such, and if the Church be not infallible, but by virtue of this tradition, as the other side saith, then they confess the insufficiency of all their proofs from Scripture, and from the authority of fathers and councils, and their authority is no more than that of any faithful or credible historian, and instead of a divine, the papists have nothing but an historical faith. I shall conclude this first answer with one syllogism from the words and assertions of Mr. White. Tradition is overthrown, if another principle of faith be added to it. But the most and learnedest doctors of the Romish Church do add another principle to it, that is, the Church's authority and infallibility, as I showed from their own words. Ergo, either tradition and all this new device, or the authority of the Romish Church is overthrown. Fourthly, answer, secondly, this new conceit directly thwarts the design of God in the writing of the Scripture, and indeed the common sense and experience of all mankind, for hereby a verbal tradition is made a more sure way of conveyance to posterity than a writing. It hath been the wisdom of God in former ages to take care that those things might be written, which he would have kept in remembrance. Exodus 17, verse 14. Write this for a memorial in a book. So little did God trust this, now supposed infallible, way of oral tradition, that he would not venture the Decalogue upon it, though the words were but few, and the importance of them so considerable, both in truth and in the apprehensions of the Jews, that if Mr. White's argument have any strength in it, it was impossible posterity should ever mistake it. But write it with his own finger once and again after the breaking of the first tables, and although, whilst the church was confined to a few families and divine revelations were frequently renewed, a verbal tradition was sufficient. Yet when the church came to be multiplied, and especially when it comes to be dispersed into all nations and revelations cease, then writing proves of absolute necessity. How far the first and wisest Christians were, from Mr. White's opinion, appears from hence. That not daring to lean upon the broken reed of oral tradition, they did earnestly desire the apostles to commit their doctrines to writing. Eusebius reports that St. Peter's hearers were not content with this way of tradition from Peter's mouth, but, for want of Mr. White's presence there to convince them of their folly, they earnestly begged it of Mark that he would leave them that doctrine in writing which they had received by word of mouth. And Hiram tells us that St. John the Evangelist was almost forced to write by all the bishops of Asia, who it seems were raw novices that did not understand their catechism nor the first principles in it, that is, the sufficiency and infallibility of oral tradition. And St. Luke gives it under his hand, not fearing either Mr. White's anger or his argument, that he wrote his gospel ad majorem asphaleon, that Christians might have the greater certainty, Luke 1, verses 3 and 4. When Job desires the perpetual continuance of his words, he wisheth, oh, that my words were now written, oh, that they were printed in a book, Job 19, verse 23. And David in the same case would not rely upon tradition, but takes this course for assurance. This shall be written for the generations to come, Psalm 102, verse 18.